In the heart of Chicago, a nightmarish story unfolded that forever changed the lives of the Gray family. Thomas Gray, a successful businessman, his wife Linda, and their 2 children appeared to be living a happy life. But behind the closed doors of their home, something dark and terrifying was brewing. Thomas was hiding secrets that ultimately led to disaster. Debts, criminal dealings, and unforgivable mistakes had trapped him. Soon, it became a threat not only to his life, but to the lives of his family. When Linda realized her husband was entangled in a dangerous game, it was already too late. Forced to save herself and their children, she fled, leaving Thomas alone to face the looming danger. But how will this chilling story end? Will they survive, or will the darkness hidden in their lives consume them all? Thomas Gray, 40 years old, is a successful businessman from Chicago. He is the owner of a construction company that handles major projects across the city. On the surface, he appears to be the perfect family man, responsible, confident, and respected in society. Thomas was someone who always seemed to achieve success, but behind this facade of perfection lay his dark side. In secret, he was involved in criminal activities, laundering money through his company. Gambling debts had pushed him to the edge, and now he was desperately trying to hold on to his position. Linda Gray, 38 years old, is a literature teacher at a middle school. She is a kind-hearted, loving wife and mother. Linda has always been someone who believes in family values, known for her compassion and attentiveness. Her students adored her for her kindness and her ability to inspire people. In her youth, she dreamed of becoming a writer but chose to dedicate her life to her family. Linda has always supported Thomas and believed in his honesty, but her character was far from weak. She had a keen sense for detecting lies and had noticed strange behavior in her husband more than once, although she never fully understood what was going on. How they met. Thomas and Linda met at a charity event 15 years ago. At the time, Linda was just starting her career as a teacher, while Thomas, a young and ambitious businessman, was just beginning his path to success. Their eyes met in the crowd, and Thomas immediately noticed her genuine smile and calm confidence. Linda, in turn, was captivated by his charisma and determination. They started dating, and a year later they were married. Thomas seemed like the perfect husband, caring, supportive, and generous. Thomas and Linda have 2 children. Samuel Gray, 12 years old. Sam is a curious and cheerful boy who loves sports and games. He has always been closer to his mother, since Linda spent a lot of time with him from a young age. Sam loves soccer and dreams of becoming a professional athlete. Emma Gray, 9 years old. Emma is a more calm and thoughtful girl who takes after her mother. She loves reading and often spends time with books that Linda gives her. She dreams of becoming a writer, just like her mother once did. Emma is very attached to her parents and her brother, though she can be shy at times. Linda was caring and thoughtful. She had always been the one to keep the family balanced, smoothing over conflicts and ensuring harmony in the home. Despite her outward calmness, she had inner anxieties about her relationship with Thomas. At times, she felt lonely, as Thomas spent more and more time at work and away from the family. Linda suspected that there were things happening in his life that she didn't know about. Thomas, on the other hand, was a man living a double life. His ambitions and desire for control had led him into a dangerous world of crime. Over the years, he became more secretive and distant. While he still loved his family, he gradually drifted away from Linda. The more his business affairs worsened, the less he felt support and understanding from her. Now, as Linda began to notice strange behaviors from her husband, their relationship grew even more strained. Arguments became more frequent, and Linda's suspicions deepened. With each passing day, the pressure on Thomas grew. His involvement in criminal deals became more dangerous, and the debts piled up. Thomas, who had once been a loving and caring father, was now often gloomy and distant. He came home late, avoided conversations with Linda, and barely interacted with the children. His mind was consumed with one thought: how to escape the mess he had gotten himself into. The children began to notice changes in their father's behavior. Samuel, who was usually so close to Thomas, tried to ask questions, play with him, or talk about his football practices, but Thomas became irritable and showed no interest in his son. One day, Samuel even overheard his parents arguing behind closed doors, and it frightened him. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel that his father wasn't the same as before. Emma, who was always quiet and more withdrawn, felt an even greater distance between herself and her father. In the past, Thomas always made time to read books with her or ask about her progress in school, but now his answers to her questions were short and distant. One day, Emma asked her mother, "Why is Dad always so angry? Does he not love us anymore?" Linda tried to comfort her daughter, explaining that Thomas was just having difficulties at work, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. Gradually, Linda began to realize that something serious was happening with Thomas. Not only had he distanced himself from her, but he had also started avoiding the children. Every day, he came home later, and every evening, the tension in the house grew. Arguments became more frequent, and the atmosphere at home grew colder. One day, Linda walked in on Thomas in his office, nervously talking on the phone. As soon as she entered the room, he abruptly ended the conversation and quickly hid the documents he had been reviewing. Linda sensed that Thomas was hiding something. One day, Samuel tried to talk to his father about his recent football match, but Thomas replied shortly and coldly, "I don't have time right now, Sam. We'll talk later." But that later never came. Samuel started to distance himself from his father, spending more time with his mother. He felt like he could no longer turn to Thomas for support, and this began to eat away at him. Emma also noticed that her father was avoiding her. She no longer asked him for help with her homework and didn't wait for their nightly reading sessions. She tried to hide her feelings, but Linda could see how much her daughter was hurting. One evening, when Thomas came home late and didn't notice Emma waiting for him in the kitchen, the little girl quietly went to her room with tears in her eyes. Seeing how much the children were suffering, Linda decided to act. She had been noticing more and more strange behavior from Thomas' secretive phone calls, mysterious meetings, hidden documents. One day, she tried to talk to Thomas, but he brushed her off, saying it wasn't her business. But Linda could no longer sit by and do nothing. She realized their family was on the verge of falling apart, and something had to be done before things spiraled out of control. After numerous failed attempts to reconnect with Thomas, Linda began to seriously suspect that he was hiding not just work-related issues, but something much more personal. The thought of infidelity crossed her mind. Every time Thomas said he had to stay late at work or meet with clients, Linda felt a growing sense of unease. His frequent absences and emotional distance were becoming increasingly apparent. One day, when Thomas left the house under the pretense of an important meeting, Linda decided to follow him. Her heart raced as she quietly slipped out of the house, got into her car, and tailed Thomas through the city streets. She couldn't believe she was doing this, but she needed to know the truth. Thomas stopped at a small, unremarkable cafe on the outskirts of town. Linda parked her car at a distance and started watching. The cafe was almost empty, but when Thomas entered, he sat down at a table with a woman Linda had never seen before. The woman was stylish, but there was something suspicious about her demeanor. Linda felt her heart sink. She watched as Thomas and the woman engaged in a tense conversation. Linda tried to listen in, but she was too far away. One thing was clear, though it wasn't just a business meeting. Thomas looked nervous, his hands trembling, and at one point, he handed the woman an envelope, which she quickly tucked into her bag. The scene filled Linda with dread. She drove back home, consumed by anxiety and suspicion. Questions swirled in her mind. What's going on? Who is this woman? Why has Thomas changed so much? Linda knew she couldn't live in the dark any longer. That night, when Thomas returned home, Linda decided to confront him. She could no longer keep everything to herself. He had just walked into the house when she stood before him. "Who is she, Thomas?" Her voice was filled with pain and anger. Thomas froze, surprised by the question, but quickly tried to justify himself. "What are you talking about?" "I was working, Linda. I don't need your suspicions right now," he replied, trying to avoid the conversation. But Linda couldn't hold back anymore. "I saw you today. You met with a woman, and it definitely wasn't work-related. I can't bear your secrets any longer, Thomas. You've become a stranger to us all. Even the kids can see that you're no longer the man you once were." Thomas frowned, his face darkening. "It's not what you think," he began, but Linda wouldn't back down. "Then what is it? You're avoiding us, you don't talk to the kids. You don't even notice how much they're suffering. What's going on, Thomas?" Thomas fell silent. Linda could see that he was hesitating, that his secret was becoming unbearable for him. And then, he took a step that would change their lives forever. "Linda, I have to tell you something." His voice grew quiet and troubled. "I'm in debt. Big debt. I got involved in things I can't get out of now. That woman, she's not a lover. She's a middleman. I owe a lot of money, and if I don't pay, they'll come for me. And for us." Linda froze. Thomas' words hit her like a thunderbolt. She couldn't believe that her husband, the successful architect, had become involved in criminal activities. Her world began to crumble before her eyes. "You're lying," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "You couldn't have done this. You couldn't have risked our family like this." But Thomas could no longer hide the truth. "I didn't know how it would end. At first, they were just small deals, easy money. But now I'm trapped, Linda. I can't get out." Now Linda knew they were in real danger. She realized that Thomas' actions could destroy their family, and that the threats he spoke of could very well become a reality. Linda felt fear for herself and their children consuming her. She understood that they were not only losing a husband and father, but were also in grave danger. Thomas suggested that Linda temporarily leave the city with the children until he could sort everything out. "You have to leave," he said with worry in his voice. "I'll find a way out of this mess, but you and the kids need to be safe." But Linda could no longer agree so easily. She knew their life would never be the same. She looked at her husband with pain and disappointment. "How can I trust you after everything that's happened?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. Thomas realized that his chances of saving his family were slipping away with each passing day. The threats from the criminal network were becoming more real, and there was almost no time left to fix things. "I know I've messed up, Linda. I understand if you can't trust me anymore. But I'm begging you for just one thing. Give me a chance to make it right," Thomas pleaded. Linda stayed silent for a long time. She knew their lives depended on the decision she made in that moment. Should she flee with the children or stay and try to save the family? But what if Thomas was no longer capable of protecting them? She knew she couldn't risk her children's lives. "We'll leave," she finally said, "but not to give you a chance to fix things. I'm leaving to protect my children from you and the world you've chosen." Thomas nodded silently, understanding that Linda had made her final decision. He watched as she packed and prepared to leave the house with Samuel and Emma. His heart was breaking with pain and guilt, but he knew it was his own mistakes that led to this. As Linda and the children drove away, Thomas was left alone in the empty house. He knew that the only way to save his family was to put an end to everything once and for all. Ahead of him lay a dangerous confrontation with those who threatened his life and the lives of his loved ones. But even if he managed to survive the situation, he knew he had already lost the most important thing, his family. ***. This version captures the emotional weight and intensity of the story as it builds to its conclusion. Linda left with the children, and Thomas was left alone in their empty house. The silence, which once felt cozy, now felt oppressive. He knew that beyond the walls of this house, a real storm was brewing. The people he had gotten involved with didn't forgive mistakes and never let their enemies go. Thomas understood that he had little time. Every night he heard sounds he hadn't noticed before. Rustling outside, distant footsteps, phone calls with no answer. The people with whom he had made criminal deals were starting to act. Thomas knew they were coming for him, and he could no longer sleep peacefully. One night, he heard a loud thud outside the window. His heart froze, and Thomas realized with horror that the moment of confrontation had arrived. He grabbed his phone but saw that the signal was gone. All the lines had been cut. There was only one thing left to do: try to protect himself and his home. He found the old revolver that once belonged to his father and sat in the corner, waiting for the inevitable. The noises outside grew louder. Footsteps approached the door. Suddenly, someone knocked. Thomas froze. It wasn't just a knock. It was a clear, confident signal that there was nowhere left to run. He didn't respond. After a few minutes, the door began to open slowly. The lock had been broken. Thomas watched as dark figures quietly entered the house. He knew these people. They were hitmen sent to settle his debts once and for all. They hadn't come to negotiate. This was the end. Clutching the revolver, Thomas realized he would have to fight for his life. He tried to prepare himself, but fear gripped him. One of the men, wearing a black jacket and with his face hidden under a hood, looked at him and sneered. "You thought you could escape us?" The man's voice was raspy, as though he'd threatened lives before. "Your game's over, Thomas. But you still have a chance to save your life. We want to know where your family is." Thomas froze. They wanted to get to Linda and the children. He knew he could no longer stay silent, that his mistake had cost not only his life, but the lives of those he loved. "They're gone. I won't tell you where." His voice trembled, but it was filled with resolve. The man sighed, as if disappointed. He took a step forward, pulling out a knife, and slowly began to approach Thomas. Thomas knew this was the end, but he was ready to do anything to protect his family. At the last moment, as the man got close, Thomas pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the night's silence. The man collapsed to the floor. The other hitmen rushed toward Thomas, and a fight ensued. After the brutal fight, Thomas remained alive, but his strength was running out. The house was dark and quiet, with only the faint echo of gunfire reminding him of the recent struggle. He stood over the body of the hitman, realizing this was just the beginning. The rest of the hitmen could be anywhere, and Thomas had to make a difficult decision: run or try to gather his remaining strength for another fight. The phone rang again, but this time it wasn't an anonymous call. Thomas looked at the screen. It was one of his former partners, the man with whom he had made his first illegal deal. "You're in deep, Thomas," said the voice on the other end. "You've got little time left. The people hunting you won't stop. They know about Linda and the kids. You have to make a choice. Either you surrender or you lose everything." Thomas had to make a decision in that very moment. He needed to find a way to protect his family, but how? He could no longer trust anyone. His criminal connections had long since lost any sense of humanity. He knew that even if he surrendered, Linda and the kids wouldn't be safe. Gathering his thoughts, Thomas did something that most would consider insane. He decided to go directly to the head of the criminal network he was connected to. This was his last chance to end the bloodshed and save his family. He left the house, taking only his revolver and the documents he had stored in his safe. These documents could be his ticket to survival, as they contained information about all the deals and financial schemes of the mafia. It was his insurance policy. Thomas headed to the heart of the criminal underworld, the old warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, where the city's crime bosses gathered. He knew this was a deadly move, but there was no other choice. When he approached the warehouse, two armed men greeted him. They knew who he was and silently led him inside. In the vast room, among the boxes and machines, stood the man Thomas knew as Marco, the head of the organization he had once worked for. Marco, tall, with a harsh face and a gaze that could make anyone feel small and insignificant, looked at Thomas with a slight smirk. "You really thought you could come back and fix everything?" Marco said. "You betrayed us, Thomas, and betrayal isn't forgiven." Thomas knew his life was hanging by a thread. He tossed the folder of documents onto the table in front of Marco. "Here's everything you need. Financial reports, schemes, your hidden accounts. All of it is my insurance. If anything happens to me or my family, these files go to the FBI." Marco, eyeing the documents with interest, smirked even wider. "You think we can be stopped with papers? But well, you're brave, Thomas, and I respect that. Maybe we can find a way out for you and your family. But there's one condition." Thomas tensed. "What condition?" "You've got to do one last favor for us. You take out one person who's been getting in the way of our business, and then we'll leave you and your family alone." Thomas froze. They were offering him a choice: get dragged back into the criminal world and become a killer, or refuse and lose everything. Thomas stood before Marco, his heart pounding at the realization of the decision he was being pushed toward. Killing to save his family, this was a choice that would forever change his life and possibly cost him his soul. But time was running out, and every moment could cost his wife and children their lives. "Who do I need to take out?" Thomas asked, his voice cold and tense. Marco smirked and handed him a photograph. It was a middle-aged man with a stern look, a man who, by all appearances, was no less dangerous than Marco himself. "This is our old friend Victor. He's gotten too ambitious, and now he wants to take over our business. You know what that means." Thomas realized he was being placed in a cruel position. He had to get rid of one criminal to save his loved ones from another. He silently took the photograph and understood that he had almost no way out. When Thomas returned home, he felt an unbearable weight fall onto his shoulders. He knew he couldn't tell Linda what was happening. She and the children had left town, thinking it was just a temporary safety measure, but Thomas knew they wouldn't return unless he completed the task. He felt trapped, realizing that his path had led him to this nightmare. Thomas spent a long time thinking, sitting in the darkness of his home. He knew that if he killed Victor, he would remain trapped in this dark world forever, but if he refused, he might lose his family. His life had crumbled, and he was forced to choose between evil and even greater evil. The next morning, he took everything he needed and set out to find Victor. Marco had given him all the coordinates. Thomas knew that Victor was hiding in a country house, guarded by his men. It wasn't going to be easy, but Thomas, once a successful businessman, knew how to find a way out of difficult situations. When he reached the country house, the tension in his chest reached its peak. He had to decide, kill Victor or try to negotiate. As he approached the house, one of the guards greeted him. Thomas said he was from Marco, and they immediately let him inside. Victor was sitting at a table in a spacious living room. When Thomas entered, he looked at him with interest. "What? Marco sent you to kill me?" Victor asked with an ironic smirk. Thomas froze. Victor knew, but how? "Don't rush," Victor continued. "You think you have a choice, Thomas, but you're wrong. You and your family are already pawns in this game. I can help you if you're on my side." Thomas felt the ground slipping from under him. Now Victor was offering him a choice: betray Marco and join his side. Thomas was caught between two dangerous criminals, and either one could destroy him if he made the wrong move. At that moment, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Linda. "Thomas, we're safe, but I can't wait any longer. I don't know what you're doing, but please come back. We just want you to be with us." Those words broke his heart. He realized he could no longer be a part of this world. He had to get out of the game. But how? Thomas made his decision. He stood up and looked at Victor. "I'm done playing your games," Thomas said firmly. "You and Marco are just two sides of the same evil. I need to get my family out of this hell, and I'm not going to kill anyone to do it." Victor fell silent, but a spark of interest lit up in his eyes. "Are you sure? Marco won't let you go. He already thinks he owns you." Thomas took a step back. "If I die, the documents and evidence will go with me, and they'll send both of you to prison. That's the only reason you haven't killed me yet." Thomas turned and walked out of the house. He knew it was a risk, but he could no longer allow this world to consume him completely. Thomas made his decision. He slowly stood up, his gaze firm and focused. All fears and doubts disappeared. There was only one goal ahead of him: to escape this deadly game and protect his family. "You think you can just walk away?" Victor sneered, watching Thomas. "No one gets out alive, Thomas. You're in this too deep." But Thomas, ignoring his words, headed for the door. He didn't want to listen to the threats anymore. He knew his decision was final. Victor began to rise from his chair, his eyes filled with rage, but at that moment, Thomas suddenly turned around, pulling a small voice recorder from his pocket, which had been recording their conversation the entire time. "You're wrong, Victor," Thomas said coldly. "Now I have something that can destroy both you and Marco. One wrong move, and these recordings will end up in the hands of the police." Victor froze, realizing that the situation had slipped out of his control. His face twisted in anger, but he didn't move. Thomas, holding the recorder in plain sight, walked out of the house. Now Thomas knew there was no going back. He had made the decision to leave this game and protect his family at all costs. As soon as he stepped outside, his heart pounded wildly. He had done it, but many dangers still lay ahead. He had to act quickly. Thomas immediately drove to the safe place where Linda and the children were staying. He gathered all the necessary documents and money, quickly contacting her. "Linda, you need to be ready to leave immediately. We're leaving for good." His voice was calm, but inside he could feel the tension rising. Linda knew the situation was serious. Without asking questions, she started preparing to leave. Thomas understood that escaping wouldn't be easy. Marco or Victor could strike at any moment, but now he had a plan. He was no longer the man they could control. Later that night, Thomas picked up Linda and the kids from their hideout. Together, they drove away, disappearing into the darkness of the night. In his hand was the recorder with the evidence that could bring down his enemies, but he knew the real battle was still ahead. The story ends with Thomas driving through the night, his family by his side, and the unknown road ahead. He was no longer a victim, but he also knew that this battle had only just begun. Thomas and his family drove down the dark highway, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. Even though he had the voice recorder with the incriminating evidence, he knew that the threats from Victor and Marco hadn't disappeared. The criminal networks he had been entangled in didn't forgive betrayal, and now his life and the lives of his family were in constant danger. Every noise, every flash of headlights on the road made him flinch. Thomas knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Their only hope was to find refuge in another city, to start a new life where no one could find them. But the next day, as Thomas stopped at a gas station to refuel, he noticed a suspicious car parked nearby. Inside were two men whose gazes were fixed on him, far too intently. His heart started racing. He quickly filled the tank and returned to Linda and the kids. "We need to keep moving," he said, getting back into the car. Linda noticed the worry on his face but said nothing. She trusted him and knew now wasn't the time to ask questions. The road ahead grew more tense. Thomas had the eerie feeling that they were being followed, though he couldn't be certain who it was, Marco's men or someone else. But he knew one thing: whoever it was wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. When the family reached a small hotel on the outskirts of the city, Thomas decided it was time to seek help. He knew the police wouldn't be of any assistance. Too many criminal ties could be exposed. But he had a plan. He remembered an old friend who had once worked for the FBI and decided to turn to him for help. After making the call, Thomas briefly explained the situation. His friend wasn't thrilled, but he agreed to help. They arranged to meet in a secret location the next day. That night was the longest for Thomas. He sat by the hotel window, holding a revolver on his lap, watching every movement outside. Linda and the kids were asleep, unaware of how close they were to danger. The next morning, Thomas gathered all the necessary documents and headed to meet his friend. He knew this could be their last chance at salvation. When they met in an abandoned parking lot, his friend was blunt. "You're in deep shit, Thomas, but I can help you. I'll take the tape recorder and those documents, and we can expose this entire network. But be prepared. There will be a price to pay." Thomas agreed, although he understood that the consequences could be severe. Now his life depended on whether they could expose Victor and Marco, and if his family could find a safe haven. Thomas handed the tape recorder to his friend from the FBI. He understood that this step could lead to the arrests of Victor, Marco, and the entire criminal network, but the danger for him and his family was still very real. Until the documents and recordings were in the hands of the authorities, they remained vulnerable. They agreed that the FBI friend would organize an operation to arrest the crime bosses in a few days. During this time, Thomas and his family had to stay hidden. His friend promised to keep them informed, but warned that during this period, they could become targets for hitmen. Returning to the hotel, Thomas told Linda about the plan. She listened with tension, knowing that their lives were hanging by a thread. But she trusted him and knew that Thomas would do everything in his power to protect them. "We need to be ready for the worst," Thomas said, looking at her. "This might be our last battle. But I'm done running." The next morning, they decided to move to a friend's house outside the city, where they could hide for a few days. But on the way, Thomas noticed in the rearview mirror the same car that had followed them the day before. His heart clenched with fear. He realized that Victor and Marco were already on his trail. Without wasting time, Thomas turned off the highway and headed into the dense woods. He knew they needed to buy time before Victor's men caught up with them. Linda and the children were frightened, but they understood it was the only way to survive. When the hitman's car closed in, a chase for their lives began. Thomas sped down narrow forest roads, trying to lose the pursuers, but they were persistent. At one point, he realized they had been caught. Unexpectedly, their car stopped near an old abandoned barn. Thomas knew there wasn't much time. "Linda, kids, run inside." "I'll hold them off," he ordered, grabbing his revolver as he got out of the car. He knew this showdown could be his last. Victor's hitmen stepped out of their car, armed and ready to finish the job. Thomas took cover behind the trees, knowing his chances were slim. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. Thomas fired toward the hitmen, trying to buy time for his family. Linda, watching from the barn, trembled with fear for her husband. But just when hope seemed lost, a team of BI agents arrived at the scene. Thomas's friend had kept his promise. The operation had begun earlier than expected. The agents surrounded the area and arrested the hitmen. Thomas emerged from his cover, breathing heavily. He was injured but knew it had been worth it. Linda rushed to him and they embraced. feeling that the nightmare was finally coming to an end. Despite everything that had happened, Thomas felt that the price had been too high. Though his family was saved, their lives would never be the same. He realized he could never return to a normal life, knowing he had betrayed the criminal world and had been forced to break his own principles to protect his family. Now Thomas and his family lived in the Witness Protection Program. They moved to a new city, changed their names, and started a new life. But Thomas always knew that somewhere in the shadows were those who would never forgive his betrayal.